First of all seriousness, I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia, the traditional owners and custodians of this land where I live and work, and pay my respects to their culture, the elders past and present and future. I also acknowledge the importance of the land to the Larrakia, to the living Larrakia people today. Lastly, I pay my respects to my Indigenous colleagues, family and friends for whom their lived experience is the imperative to keep doing what I do, basically, without sounding like an incredible do-gooder. I was going to use a ruder word, but I won't. Okay, so this is a little bit about me because I do like talking about myself and I'm very confident talking about myself. Basically, I'm a 32... No, I am not 32. I am 62. Okay, nerves are getting the better of me. I'm a third generation do-gooder is what I was going to say. So, hence. Clearly I was destined to be a nurse early on. See that cute little photograph up the top there of me when I was 3. Also a third generation nurse, so it was in the blood, but I fought it for a long time. I did an interesting but useless arts degree at ANU. Came up here to do my nursing training because I wanted to go and work remote, which I did. Then I came back into town because you have to eventually, and did my grad dip ed and went back out bush teaching. And what I've done since has been a sort of a combination of the health and education qualifications. I also did a Masters of Education, which I actually learnt quite a bit out of. I also worked at what was Bachelor College and wrote the original Aboriginal health worker courses. So that's also informed a lot of what I've done. You can see various pictures of my family. I'm a grammar Nazi. I love yoga. Dyed in the wool, absolutely, irretrievably, sadly, a Collingwood supporter. And this photograph here, this is also one of my imperatives. It's a photograph of my dad and his best friend in the entire world. Okay, so this is how I'm feeling at the moment, like I'm unravelling basically. And I also was trying to find a picture of a brain as a sieve with all this stuff going in and just sort of pouring out and making a mess on the floor. In the beginning, I have to acknowledge and pay my respects to my initial supervisor who said, really, no, I don't think that's what you're doing, quite a lot until I actually formulated my research question. And that was Professor Rose McEldowney, who retired and went back to New Zealand about 18 months ago. Then helping me down the home stretch, Gretchen Ennis, who's here, Sadie, who's here, and Madalena Topher, who is at Macquarie Uni in New South Wales, but used to work here. And she's tough. Gretchen's my blunt supervisor, Ms. Blunty. And Sadie's just been very helpful, I have to say. Okay. Take that as you will. Okay, so this is my research question, and you'll need to keep this in the back of your mind so I don't have to keep saying it. What I ended up looking at, what preparation do health professionals require to work effectively in Indigenous primary healthcare contexts, and that's urban, rural and remote. And I'll get to the reasons that I'm stressing the urban, rural and remote a bit later. Okay, now this is the story that really formed the catalyst for, or the, highlighted what, it gave me the push to do my PhD, I guess. Many years ago, probably 10 years ago, or maybe not quite that many, maybe, yeah, anyway. I was doing a working cross-culturally session in a remote health orientation program. And we had a whole day with these poor folk, and I was doing the first session and setting it up to talk about cultural safety, what cultural safety is and how important it is to practice. And there was this young man, a nurse from Tasmania. That's okay, I was born in Tassie, so, what do you call it? Approach diversity. And he'd come up to work out on a remote community in northeast Arnhem Land, never knowingly met an Aboriginal person before, and he was an interesting chap. Anyway, 20 minutes in to my session, he goes, puts his hand up and he says, excuse me, this cultural safety stuff's bullshit, isn't it? And I said, well, I'm glad that you feel comfortable enough to, express your opinions. And so shall we unpack this a little bit more? So we had quite a robust discussion, several, over the course of the day. And then, I sort of went home and mainlined a bottle of wine. No, not really, I haven't got the liver for that. And then about 18 months later, I was doing a session in a chronic conditions workshop for the Department of Health. They got a lot out of me for nothing. Anyone from the department here? No. Okay, so and this guy walks in, and he'd been out in the remote community for about 18 months at that stage, and he says, "Oh, good, I wanted to catch up with you." And I went, "What now? Excellent." And he said, "I've been thinking about that cultural safety stuff you were talking about, and I think I know I'm beginning to get a sense of it now." And I went, "Okay, let's have another conversation," because I had a light bulb moment as to what could have possibly prompted his light bulb moment or his epiphany. So it got me thinking, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we provide, as educators and as employers in particular, and as organisations, how do we provide the opportunity to build this capacity and maintain this capacity in people? Yeah? So that's what started. And the reason that there's a photograph of Kale's Crossing there is not that we literally went swimming with the crocodiles, but that's what this whole process, like a lot of my working life, and certainly the process of doing the PhD has felt like. Right. So now that's the fun story as to why I'm doing the PhD. Now the sort of the real reason, or the official reason, is that, as most of you know, recruitment and retention issues in the health workforce, particularly in Northern Australia, it's a critical issue. And I've been in the Northern Territory for the better part of, nearly 40 years, and basically things have got a lot worse in a lot of ways. But I won't digress into that because I'm very good at digressing. So there's an incredibly high turnover of staff, again, particularly in Northern Australia, working in remote areas. And while I'm not focusing on remote areas, this has implications for the thesis. So, and that of course impacts on delivery and effectiveness of healthcare. Now, the literature shows us that the reason, even though we know a lot of this stuff anecdotally, the literature does show us that reasons for this high turnover include burnout of staff, culture shock, lack of appropriate orientation and professional development opportunities, and that was always a big thing of mine. All the years I've been working, I've been jumping up and down about that. And there's very limited policy or strategies or initiatives for staff working in Indigenous health, really. So what happens as a result of all this is there's basically the clients have compromised access to a stable service that meets their needs. So, it's impacting negatively on the very people we're hoping to, improve their health outcomes. It means an exacerbation of the already existing Indigenous health inequities, which, it's not what we're here for. And it also means a reduction in community, and I use that word really broadly, like the population confidence in the provision of culturally safe healthcare. Because, if people believe the care they're going to get is culturally safe, then they're more likely to access it. So all that stuff has an impact. Okay. Therefore, and this is the the shining line, the establishment and contribution of a consistent, culturally safe and effective workforce is seen as crucial to enabling equity and access to healthcare and improving health outcomes. So it's not just about access, but it's a big part of the picture. Okay, so what did I end up doing about this? Well, I won't read the question out again, but essentially I interviewed 22 health professionals, largely reflective of the health workforce. So predominantly, I think there were 17 nurses, 3 doctors, medical doctors, who also did PhDs, overachievers, and 2 allied health professionals. And they all work, or they all are or have been working in a mixture of urban, rural and remote locations. So there were a couple of people that only worked in urban Indigenous primary healthcare contexts, but the majority had worked at least part of the time in remote. So basically I had a lovely time getting the data, you know, lots of big chats, intense conversations with people through in-depth interviews. And yeah, there was much sharing of stories and educational and practice experiences. I did have to remind myself from very early on that it wasn't all about me. And even though that absolutely informed what I was doing, I had to go, yeah, no, but I had to go and, oh, okay, so you think nurses aren't very good at primary healthcare, doctor? Right, fine. And what I'm sincerely hoping, even though I know there's a very big graveyard for PhDs, what I'm really hoping is that this work will contribute to education and practice about how health professionals can work more effectively in Indigenous primary health care and ultimately contribute to better health outcomes. That's the, you know, that's the, I won't say pie in the sky because I think it's achievable, but that's what I want to do. And as that says, so many tangents, so little time. I have to say here, Gretchen has the patience of a saint, and very nicely, before she transformed into Ms. Blunty, she would say very nicely, okay, now you've written the book on critical theory, you need to actually, well, you haven't actually used it, so perhaps. And so, like, really good at not saying, oh my expletive deleted deity, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. She actually said, pointed me in the right direction and kept, I think she's been fishing and just reeling me in. Anyway, that's enough of that little tangent. Okay, the literature review. This is killing me. Like I say this about every chapter. I've just sent Gretchen the draft of my literature review, and already I'm thinking, oh no, I haven't done this and I haven't done that, which is, you know, very much part of the process. But this is actually a really useful thing to do, believe it or not. I have 394 references in my EndNote library, which I actually reformatted 100 of those because I didn't think EndNote had done it properly. I've since had to go back and reformat them. So better to discover that now than later. Anyway, so basically what came out, because so I did an initial literature review in order to see what was out there and what other people had done, and if my question was actually going to be useful and, you know, fill a gap, and of course it was, but, you know, you have to actually provide the evidence. And what came out of the ongoing literature review were these 4 key areas which informed the rest of the research study. Okay, and that is me and my study. So what the literature shows is quite a bit about some things. Leave it at that? Yeah. Okay, so there's extensive amount of literature, particularly in terms of textbooks, for the profile of the Australian health workforce. There's a lot. Unsurprisingly, for those of you who are in the health workforce, the medical profession, who comprises maybe 10% of the health workforce, it's not much anyway, the amount of literature about them is like way over the odds. I'll just leave that with you. There are, in terms of what our work consists of, increasingly complex and demanding health issues. You know, for example, chronic conditions, what I call the tsunami of chronic conditions, and the impact of that on everyone. There's still, I think, and I don't know that it's getting any better or there's been much progress, there's an often problematic transition between university education and working as a new graduate. But that's a whole other thesis in itself, of course. There's quite a bit of literature on that. There's a noticeable lack of graduate support programs for allied health practitioners. There's a lot for medical doctors, including their sort of ongoing professional development. There are graduate programs for nurses, but there's very little for allied health, for that broad umbrella for allied health. And, you know, they're critical, of course, for our health workforce. Anyway, there's a reasonable amount of literature about the critical importance of placements for students and upon graduation. There's an increasing focus on rural and remote health workforce, but there's really very few people that are actually writing on that. They tend to sort of cite each other, really. And there was like a flurry of activity between 2008 and 2013, but not a lot since then, except on maybe, you know, very specific things like giving cardiac medications to people over the age of 10. You know, there might be a specific focus like that. And still, my little favourite, cultural safety education in healthcare is a significant site of resistance and struggle. Just talk to any New Zealander. Okay, so the gaps in the literature, many. So I've just done a little summary here. So in terms of a profile or type of health professionals working in Indigenous primary health care, we really don't know in any detail, certainly in the literature, who these people are. We don't know why they choose to work and stay in Indigenous health, why and how they engage with the practice context, how they navigate being safe and effective practitioners in this context. So all this is good for me, isn't it? You know. There is also, which took me a little while to come to the front of my brain. There's also a lack of policies, strategies, programs, or even frameworks specifically aimed at career pathways for health professionals wanting to work in Indigenous health. Plenty for other areas. There's also a gap in the literature in terms of skill sets, like what health professionals actually require to work in this context. So what there is tends to focus on remote practice or Indigenous health in general, but there's certainly nothing that I could find on urban Indigenous health practice. There's nothing that specifically looks at that and unpacks that. They might talk about a particular aspect, but it's in relation to like a more general health workforce issue, like recruitment and retention. And certainly there's an emphasis on clinical skills rather than non-clinical. Now, we need clinical skills, don't get me wrong, not saying we don't, but the emphasis on what makes a good health professional is someone that's clinically competent, and there's very little done on other aspects. And also for people working in Indigenous primary health care, there is, and particularly remote again, there's a challenge of maintaining currency and developing specific skill sets required, particularly in regards to changes in practice. So what I mean by that is, so in terms of like, say, chronic conditions, the demographic you're working with, cultural safety, community development, primary healthcare, you know, there's a whole lot of other things that we need to be part of the whole education and professional development picture. Another one of my favourites, teaching, terminology and orientation. Okay, so those of us in the teaching space, there are expectations of and support. There's nothing really about what we're expected to do and how we're supported and the workloads of staff who are teaching and or working in Indigenous health. So there's, well, you know, those of my colleagues would say there's probably very little support for those of us teaching anyway, but is this being recorded? Yep. But certainly for the tricky areas, what I call the tricky areas, like cultural safety, there's nothing that actually, there's no safe space, there's no learning space except from other colleagues who happen to be in a similar space. That's what I'm saying. So it can be a really lonely existence. It's a bit like many years ago when I was doing my grad dip ed, I did a consultancy for the Family Planning Association, teaching what was called sex education in schools. Oh, what could possibly go wrong? And, you know, I'd go and the teacher would say, are you a qualified teacher? And I go, yep. And they go, oh. So they disappear, or they sit down the back of the class and hide behind a maths textbook or something like that, because that was your job. I'm the classroom teacher. I'm not engaging in that. And it's a little bit like that with cultural safety education. That's what Robyn keeps banging on about, even though we're all mandated to do it. There's also very little literature about the capacity and preparedness of staff that are teaching in this space. And this is my sort of current pet peeve at the moment, particularly given the definition that AHPRA, let me get this right, Australian Health Regulation Professional Association, is that right? Ah, that's it. Thank you. I knew someone had. Anyway, the people that sort of manage all you registered lot, they've recently put out for consultation. They want to redefine cultural safety. Well, I won't say what I really think, but anyway. So there's still a conflation of terms that refer to, like, put Indigenous health, cultural diversity and cultural safety all in the one basket. And while they might not use them interchangeably, when I'm talking about cultural safety, people assume I'm talking about Indigenous health. Not necessarily. Overlap, but not necessarily. And also another big thing that I've been quite passionate about for a long time, orientation and induction of staff working in Indigenous primary healthcare contexts. There's literature about induction and orientation to working a little bit rural but mostly remote, but there's nothing about actually orientation and induction for people working in, say, Aboriginal community controlled health organisation. I couldn't find anything. Now, look, I do love a diagram, and this is something else that I know I'm going to have to cull, possibly, but a lot of thought's gone into this. I just want you to know that. And so what I did, and look, I don't care if it stays in the thesis or not, but what this helped me do was get my thoughts into some kind of format. So there should be arrows going from social position or standpoint to the epistemology, and to the axiological position, and to the methodology. So those three things feed into the methodology bit, and then the methodology, the arrows should go to the method and the data analysis. A little bit hard to see without the arrows, isn't it? That's most unfortunate. I don't need to talk about that, do I? Do I need to talk about that? No. Good job. Okay, but I'm happy to answer questions. Okay? So, what I ended up with was constructivist grounded theory. One of my biggest struggles was where to put the capitals, but I think, I'm just going to be consistent from now on. I went very early on at the beginning of when I first got serious about this, so like end of 2013, early 2014, another senior researcher who shall remain nameless, Anne Lowell, said to me, oh, you're using grounded theory. And I said, no, I'm not. No, I don't even really know what that is, but no, I'm not. And then quite some time later, Gretchen said something about my grounded theory approach, and I went, okay, so turned out I was. And so I've done considerable amount of reading on this, needless to say. I've got lots of books and, well, a couple of books and lots of articles and highlighted everything. So, and I like this because for me, who I am, what I bring to it, it provides a suite of research design possibilities. So, you know, there's endless possibilities. In some ways, it's a little bit tricky because then I go all Libran, even though I'm not, and find it hard to make a decision. But it opens up a lot of possibilities so you can get the right fit for what you're doing and what resonates for you. Builds research processes and outcomes from what already is out there in terms of structural contexts, occurs in emerging and changing conditions. And this is the bit that I like the best because it, you know, brings it back to me. Influenced by the researcher's worldview, standpoints, relationships and surroundings. Because I never would have been a quantitative researcher. One, I had a phobia about statistics, but I got counselling for that. I'm okay now. But two, for me, it's a bit like the difference for me between Iyengar yoga and Satyananda yoga. Satyananda yoga suits me much more than Iyengar yoga, which is more linear and progressive and you've got an end point, whereas qualitative research opens up, for me, a lot more possibilities. And I like connecting things and seeing what links and the relationships. Also, this approach takes a reflective stance, so by interpreting meanings and actions, and that's how you get your theory to happen, you know, considering how theories evolve. How did I do, Coach? Okay, so, and this is my third supervisor, Maddie Topher, said, you haven't actually said why you're using grounded theory. I thought I had, but apparently not. So this was good for me to go back and go, well, okay, I know why I'm using it, but how can I make that sound like I know why I'm using it? So, and I think, again, primarily it's because I share a history and experiences with people, the health professionals working in Indigenous primary health care contexts. So I can, using CGT for reasons of brevity, I can identify how myself and my history are present in this research process. You know, I can be upfront and transparent about it. I can acknowledge the subjectivity and not apologise for it, and my involvement in the construction and interpretation of data. It allows me to view knowing and learning as embedded in social life. It draws on the totality of my experience in deciding which methodological approach, including methods, to actually use. Like, it allowed me to do that. And also use a reflexive approach in order to ensure quality and ethical integrity. So it's very important that all those things came together. So I hope that explains that retrospective why I'm using grounded theory. So there's that should have an S on the end. There's my methods. Sampling. Yep, well, again, it was a case of what am I doing? No, yep, no. Or maybe it's a combination. So convenience, purposive, and also the participant selection criteria. So later, if people are interested, I can talk about that. Data collection, like I said, in-depth and follow-up interviews. I also did extensive memoing, and journaling, and lots and lots of diagrams and models. I've got so many pretty pictures which will never see the light of day. Also, there are ethical considerations, and so I had to go back and go, well, I don't think there are any ethical issues, but as one of the supervisors said, well, that rings alarm bells, so you need to go back and have a think about that and think about the difference between procedural ethics, like, ethics committees, and what did she call processual process? So I thought, oh yeah, okay, yep. So that makes sense. So I'm in the process of fixing that up, and also not being defensive, but saying why this is rigorous and trustworthy research. I think that's very important. Okay. Limitations of the study. Well, not enough time and interest really. I think people would lose the will to live. Now I need to refer to my notes for this one. Oh look, there's a couple of chapters which even my most devoted principal supervisor said, will you halve it? Take that out. Shouldn't be in there. Okay, so philosophical and methodological variations, like, for example, challenges of, in regards to the practicalities of involving the participants, continuing to involve them in a meaningful way throughout the research process, as they're all over the country, really. They're not sort of all just down the road in Milner, for example. So that was one of the challenges, and I don't know why that's an incredibly huge font, but there you go. Lack of application of critical inquiry theory into important issues, including power structures of the Australian health system. Now, I could be really childish and stamp my foot and say Gretchen wouldn't let me, but no. It's not. You can only fit so much in, and I didn't use a critical inquiry theory or critical theory or whatever you want to call it. I didn't end up using that. Red heaps really appealed, but it wasn't the time or the place. Later maybe, when I'm rich and famous. Because one of the things that appealed to me was looking in what the power structures of the health system. It's always fascinated me, but it was one of those tangents that I was talking about earlier. Don't go there. Just refer to it in context, but don't go down that critical theory path. There was also restricted questioning of some of the key issues. And again, for the sake of the PhD and the lifespan of the examiners, I think. So the reasons, it's all coming apart. So the limitations were partly, well, as I said, for the necessary constraints of a doctoral research, and also I think partly due to the fluid and flexible nature of the chosen methodology. Okay, so that's all I got so far. Okay, that's coming out a different colour. How interesting. All right. So now this one I'm super proud of, and that's going to stay. This is what's come out of the data. It's really exciting because Gretchen in particular kept saying to me, no, look, it'll come. And you'll have these epiphanies and it'll come. And I'm going, oh, really? I'm just waiting. And how many times have I read these transcripts? But it did, and even up until relatively recently, the title of a couple of those themes had to change in order to reflect the data. Not what I was looking for, but what came out of the data. Again, look, I'm not going to go into those in any detail. I think that's another talk somewhere else. Suffice to say that the data was shouting at me, loud and clear, and I've done a few conference presentations to organisations that if they're not, they should be interested, like CATSANAM, the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, CRANA, Council of Remote Area Nurses and others, plus, yes, quite a few organisations, because these people weren't making it up. I'm not making this up. I actually have got the quotes to back it up, which was quite a relief, Sadie, I must say. I wasn't making it up either. This is the data that's come out of this. So and organising that into an accessible format was interesting. So the 4 main themes, just quickly, found what actually goes into making up. What does an effective practitioner look like? Theme 2, education. So that includes undergraduate, what else have I got there? Placements, informal education or experiential on-the-job learning, and professional development. So that's, you know, quite a big one in itself, but education seems to cover that. Third one is actual engagement with the practice context. So working in Indigenous primary health care, choosing to work there, what the attractions of the work are. Orientation, so what and how happens there or should happen. What is Indigenous primary health care? I keep talking about it, but what is it? What is that? What do people think that is? And challenges in the workspace. Looking after yourself and mentoring were 2 of the key sub-themes that came out of that. Last one nearly did my head in. It started off as by like a chance remark from one of the participants. Oh, you should talk to my ex-husband because he was a good nurse. Oh, what makes a good nurse? Oh, you know, clinically very competent, great in an emergency. Now we just had talked for about, I kid you not, 40 minutes of primary healthcare, cultural safety, experiences, you know, blah, 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 and then she goes and tosses that little grenade in. So we had to go back and unpack that. And it was really interesting because, as I said at the outset, that's still what a lot of the literature is about, is focusing on competent and confident practitioners being clinically competent and confident. And again, absolutely you need to be good at the job, and the participants very clearly, every single one of them said that you need to be good at your job, you need to be clinically competent because that's what we're there for, but at best that's 1/3 of the skill set required. Anyway, I've just sort of digressed a bit with that. Then it ended up being, okay, in terms of answering the research question, let's get back to that, it was about negotiation of culturally safe practice. So cultural safety, cultural competency and skill sets, working cross-culturally, Indigenous peoples and ways of working. So look, it works for me, and I'm hoping by the time I've finished with that blessed chapter, it will be clear to other people as well. Okay, so emerging discussion points. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but like this stuff was coming out early on, loud and clear, so I'm just going to throw a couple of things your way, because this is what people were practically, you know, yeah, like I said, it came out loud and clear. It is really necessary to have a strong sense of self. For working in this space, you need to have a strong sense of self. Personal, and that's in regards to personal and professional identity. So you need to know who you are. It's also a key component of cultural safety. So I'm thinking that that's one of the links. Cultural safety, and this is, you know, like I was very careful not to go, well, do you think cultural safety and Indigenous health should be in the curricula? Very careful not to say that. This, again, this comes from the data. Cultural safety and Indigenous health need to be core units in all health professional curricula, not just for nurses and midwives where it's mandated through the professional, what do you call it, standards? Yes? No? Codes? Anyway. But people said, yeah, no, absolutely, because, well, I won't go down that tangent, that'll be in the discussion point, but suffice to say that's what happened. Being a good health professional means developing skill sets, like a range of skill sets that include effective communication, developing relationships and building trust. Again, that came out loud and clear. And also sustainable engagement, and that's really, you know, that's what we're on about. Sustainable engagement with the work context, whatever it is, means addressing workforce issues at all levels. So not just you, not just your supervisor, not just your organisational head, but all levels throughout the system. And I'm pleased to say certainly my experience in the Northern Territory that this is happening now. We've got a lot of buy-in from professional organisations, and certainly in the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, there's some good stuff happening. So where to from here? Again, jumping the gun a little bit in terms of recommendations, but you know, like what I said, I can't sort of pretend it didn't come out. That there still needs to be a concerted and systematic reorientation of the education of health professionals, so including graduate studies and professional development, to comprehensive, like true comprehensive primary health care, not to be confused with primary care, kill me now, cultural safety and specific practice contests. You know, we need to be not just teaching people to go and work in the tertiary sector, like i.e. hospitals. You know, there's a big world out there, and we need to be saying to people why and how you can work in these different contexts. Ensuring transparent and well-resourced career pathways for all health professionals working in Indigenous health. When I first started back in the 80s, last century, it was kind of like that's where all good do-gooders went to die, all lefties went to languish, kind of thing. Go and work in an Aboriginal area. It's like, yeah, okay, if you must. Nice scenery. And not necessarily rural and remote, because we, you know, like I said before, the focus is still very much on Indigenous health. Oh, that must be rural and remote, completely negating the huge urban, or mostly urban population. Embedding flexible and comprehensive orientation programs that meet local community needs, organisation and system requirements. And, this would be nice, consistent national policy and strategic responses to government priorities. So not just trotting out close the gap, but actually having policy and strategies for health professionals working in Indigenous primary healthcare contexts. Oh. Ah, that's the last one. That's it.